Unstoppable collapse, how to avoid the worst. I'm Michael Dowd, and I'm recording this on January 8th of 2021. This program is in 4 parts, and it's going to be emotionally challenging. If you're not already aware of this, it's going to be very emotionally challenging. So I encourage you to actually stop the recording and just pause and take a breath and take a walk or whatever after each of these 4 segments. The great acceleration, abrupt loss of Gaian stability, progress, overshoot, regress, the life cycle of civilizations, 10 certainties, pro-future versus anti-future hopes, and it's not too late, taking responsibility for our legacy. Over the course of the last year, I've created 3 videos that encompass 8 years of study. I've spent the last 8 years between 20 and 50 hours a week studying the rise and fall of civilizations, collapse, abrupt climate change, and ecology and that sort of thing. And I've put all this together in 3.5 hours, 3 videos: Collapse 101, the inevitable fruit of progress; Post-gloom, deeply adapting to reality; and Sustainability 101, indigenuity is not optional. I'll say more about these at the end, but I thought I was done. I thought basically I'm now going to just retire. I just moved, my wife and I just moved 2 blocks away from our 7-month-old granddaughter. But what occurred to me is that there are many ways that people are talking about our predicament that actually are leading us in the wrong direction. We are at risk of civilizational collapse. It's not too late to win the climate war. We can solve the crisis and get to net zero. The window of opportunity for bold action is closing. Green tech or green growth can reverse global warming. It is still possible to avoid civilizational collapse. And without, a Green New Deal or whatever, we're doomed. These ways of talking about it actually they lead us in the opposite direction of what we need to truly do. This is why I'm creating this video. William Catton's book, Overshoot, the single most important book I've ever read in my life, nothing else even close to it. My wife feels the same way. We've got a couple dozen colleagues that feel the same way. And the last chapter, chapter 15, is titled Facing the Future Wisely. And the very last section in that chapter, our best bet, expect the worst. And the core, the essence is that only by assuming the worst and acting accordingly do we have any real chance of avoiding the worst. So these ways of languaging it are not accepting the worst, and they lead us in the opposite direction. That's what this whole program is about. So here's the thesis. Here's where I'm going. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable, out of control mode for decades. This great acceleration of Gaian collapse is an easily verifiable fact. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Evidence is also compelling that the vast majority of people will deny this, especially those still benefiting from the existing order, and those who fear that accepting reality means giving up. The history of scores of previous boom and bust, that is progress, regress societies, clearly reveals how and why industrial civilization is dying. Accepting that Homo colossus's condition is incurable and terminal may be key to not making a bad situation catastrophically worse. I suggest that to avoid becoming evil on a geological timescale, we must do 3 things: minimize the deadliest of our toxicity, nuclear, methane, chemicals; assist plants, especially trees, in migrating poleward; and invest time, energy, and resources in all things regenerative. I'll say more about these later on, but especially that 3rd one there. Kate Marvel is a climate scientist, and I like this quote. She says, "We need courage, not hope, to face climate change. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending." Clarissa Pinkola Estes, "Do not lose heart. We were made for these times." And one of my favorite authors, Robin Wall Kimmerer, "Action on behalf of life transforms. Because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal, it's not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us." So I will be using some strong, morally laden language. And so in order to do that, because that's not usually done in science programs, I want to talk about just briefly the ecological and evolutionary role of morality. Like, what's the purpose of language of good and evil? Like, what's the evolutionary and ecological role of morally strong language? Well, it's to ensure fidelity to reality, faithfulness to the past, faithfulness to the future. Turns out that acting with the seventh generation in mind isn't just a good idea. To do otherwise is evil. And being faithful to the body of life, primary reality, honoring primary reality as primary. All indigenous peoples know this and have known this, that is moral language. Good is what promotes ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness, in that order. Evil is what diminishes or destroys ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness. This is not moral rocket science. We don't need 10 commandments to tell us this. And I cover this in some depth in my Sustainability 101, Indigenuity is Not Optional program. Sustainable means faithful to the future. Unsustainable means unfaithful to the future. And I suggest that everything else is but a footnote or a distraction. So why wouldn't we prioritize these? Sparing the future our deadliest toxicity, saving thousands of species of plants and trees, and learning and applying regenerative wisdom. Like, these seem to be obvious. Like, why wouldn't we prioritize these above virtually everything else? Well, in my experience, there's two things. One is, if we have a human-centered, that is an anthropocentric view of progress, and if we lack an ecological and historical understanding of collapse. And it turns out most of us have a human-centered view of progress, and most of us lack an ecological and historical understanding of collapse, which is why we as a species, as a society, as cultures, are not prioritizing these. So that's why I've created this program. I did a program a couple of years ago called Sane versus Insane Progress. It's just a 20-minute video. It's up on YouTube. And these 4 points, I want to bring them in here, because how we define and measure progress determines our behavior and what kind of a world that we're leaving our grandchildren and other species. Banking on technofix or political solutions will lead to catastrophic nuclear meltdowns and incalculable needless extinctions. Problems caused by economic growth and development will not be solved by more of the same. Indeed, our predicament will worsen. And understanding ecology, energy, and history undermines expectations that human ingenuity, technology, or the market can save industrial civilization. Turns out that ingenuity, technology, and the market is what got us into this mess in the first place. So I want to really focus on the second one. Banking on technofix or political so-called solutions will lead to catastrophic nuclear meltdowns and incalculable needless extinctions. So here is the basic ecocidal pattern of virtually all anthropocentric civilizations. We have dozens and dozens of examples of this. This is the last 5% of human history, the last 8,000 years or so, 400 generations. And as I said, we have dozens or scores of examples where we see the well-being of the elites and the ruling class, what gets called wealth and progress, goes up. But the well-being of the bioregion and the habitat, that is carrying capacity, that's an ecological concept, real wealth, goes down. And this becomes obvious when we understand ecology, energy, and history. Those three are fundamental to understanding the human enterprise, the human history. And these books, I'm mentioning these resources because I'm assuming that some people will want to go more deeply into these ideas, and I've recorded these. A Forest Journey, The Story of Wood and the Civilization by John Perlin. Actually, Connie, my wife, recorded key chapters, audio recorded key chapters of that. He details over and over, it's relentless how many societies and civilizations destroyed the forests, the soil washed away, and the civilization collapses. Geodestinies, The Inevitable Control of Earth's Resources Over Nations and Individuals by Walter Youngquist. A New Green History of the World, The Environment and the Collapse of Great Civilizations by Clive Ponting. And then the most important book I've ever read, Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change by William Catton. One of the other things that we always see, or virtually always see, in collapsing civilizations is denial, denial, denial. Most people, not just the elites, but most people stay in denial. For example, Here we have a classic example of what almost always happens, which is the elites and those who are powerful and those who are educated and bright basically say, hey, it's never been better. You know, they're the prophets of progress, The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. Peter Diamandis, Abundance, the future is better than you think. Factfulness by Hans Rosling, 10 reasons we're wrong about the world and why things are better than you think. And then Steven Pinker, the best known, Enlightenment Now, the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress. These are all New York Times bestsellers. These are brilliantly written. These are really awesome people who write them. However, what they focus on is true, and what they ignore is catastrophic. For example, Steven Pinker, also in The Better Angels of Our Nature, he has chart after chart after chart that shows how things are getting better over the last 250, 300 years, at least for the elite. For the most privileged, things have never been better. And he rightfully says, he's got 75 charts, for example, in his most recent book, that technological progress and expansion and economic growth and development are what has allowed that to be, which is true. The problem is that technological progress and expansion and economic growth and development are also leading to the catastrophic decline, collapse of every single thing we depend upon. Overdevelopment, overpopulation, overshoot, which of course is leading to climate change, soil, forests, water, species, the loss of soil organisms, nutrients, groundwater, glaciers, rapidly and significantly expanding deserts, deadly droughts, heat waves, hurricanes, flooding, oceanic acidification and dead zones, plastic pollution, nuclear wastes, toxic air, water, and soil, and the catastrophic loss of so many species. We are in the sixth great extinction. It's called a biological annihilation. And so we need to call this what it is. It's technological devastation and ecocide, and economic insanity and destruction. That's really what it is. As all indigenous peoples have known, if you have an economy, your basic system for exchanging goods and services that diminishes or destroys everything you rely upon, this is insane if the word has any meaning. Now, how is it that these prophets of progress don't see this? And throughout human history, the elites typically have stayed in denial the longest. Why is that? Well, I suggest that it's being blinded by their religion. Now, what do I mean? Steven Pinker's a known atheist. What do I mean blinded by their religion? Well, I love this quote from Steven Weinberg. He says, with or without religion, good people can behave well and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. Now, he was critiquing the monotheistic faiths, but it's even more true of the secular religion, the invisible religion of perpetual progress. Now, by religion, I'm not meaning belief in otherworldly entities. I'm meaning your basic worldview that gives you your most fundamental values and understanding of how we got here, the nature of things, and how things are to be into the future. Here's the creation myth of the secular religion of perpetual progress. You know, you got the Stone Age, cavemen, savages, primitives, hunter-gatherers. Things really start getting good with the agricultural revolution. Notice the positive term. Farming, cities, civilization. And then the Enlightenment. Notice the positive turn. Reason, science, humanism, progress. And the reason I have exclamation points is this is the enthusiasm with which these prophets of progress speak. The Industrial Revolution. Again, notice the positive term. Fossil fuels, technology. And then space travel, globalization. Most techno-optimists, at least until recently, had a Star Trek vision of the future, and some like Elon Musk and others still do. I preached this. This was the gospel. This was a core part of my message for 12 years, from 2000 to December 3rd of 2012. I now consider this the techno-idolatrous ecocidal myth of man, conqueror of nature. I believe that thought form, man, conqueror of nature, is the single most self-destructive and idolatrous thought form in human history. And by idol or idolatrous, I don't mean bowing down to statues. I mean anthropocentrism, human-centeredness. Good people are dangerous, and great people will engage in great evil when they hold the ecocidal and self-terminating belief that we are destiny's darlings, masters of the universe, conquerors of nature, God's chosen species, or the pinnacle of evolution. So I'll be speaking about collapse, not as a building collapsing like the Arecibo Observatory collapsed a month ago. Not in that way. I'm speaking about it in ecological and civilizational way. Collapse is when a gradual downward trend in biophysical health and well-being goes into unstoppable decline. runaway, out of control, such as abrupt climate change. Oh, let me say something about this. If you don't understand, if you don't have an ecological understanding of collapse, you're not going to be aware that when you're in the presence of these great redwoods out in like Humboldt County, California, where Connie and I spent close to a year last year, you're not going to be aware that these forests are in collapse. They're not producing cones. The only trees that are producing cones are those that are artificially watered. This is collapse, but you've got to have an ecological mindset to see it. So collapse, a gradual downward trend when it becomes unstoppable, out of control, irreversible. Collapse is a process. It's not an event. That's vital to understand this. Often decades long, sometimes a century or two. So here we have industrial civilization. And on the left, you've got biospheric well-being, not just human well-being, but biosphere's well-being. Gaian stability is the way I talked about it before. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable, out of control, runaway mode for 2 to 7 decades. So 2 decades ago was 1950, or 2 decades ago, 2 decades ago is 2000, 7 decades ago is 1950. And so this is known as the Great Acceleration. And you don't have to take my word on it, just Google the Great Acceleration. You'll find dozens and dozens and dozens of charts. And what they're meaning is that from about 1750 to present, you see a hockey stick from about 50 years ago. Now, of course, they show it going up. They show it like this. If you Google the Great Acceleration, this is what you're going to find. Socioeconomic trends on the left, things like population, GDP, large dams, paper production, fertilizer consumption, and so forth. And on the right, you see all the Earth system trends. But those are the things that actually are biosphere stability. They're not going up, they're going down. So on the left, they're really ecocidal trends. That's what's causing ecocide. And on the right is Earth system collapse. But again, we get the wrong impression if we see all these things going up like this. So you can also Google, in addition to the Great Acceleration, measures of the Anthropocene, and you'll find charts like this. And again, if you don't read them carefully, you won't realize that, not only since 1950 and 2000 is 20 years ago, but even this chart's a little bit outdated now. And there's a book, The Great Acceleration, How the World is Getting Faster, Faster, by Robert Colville. And again, you've got the socioeconomic trends and Earth system trends. But the socioeconomic trends include things like river dams, tourism, motor vehicles, McDonald's restaurants as a proxy for economic growth. So these are the causes of biosphere collapse, is what those are. And this is our only life support system. So again, we need to call these for what they really are: ecocidal trends and Earth system collapse trends. So I switched it around just so we get a more accurate picture here. So again, this is 2000 there. We're now at 2020. But Gaia's stability has been in decline for 1 or 2 centuries and in irreversible collapse for 2 to 7 decades. The climate, Holocene stability, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, these are now in runaway mode. If every human being woke up tomorrow morning committed to doing the right thing, or if we all died, if some virus wiped us out, all of us overnight, we would still see massive amounts of methane and nitrous oxide, and the forests of the world are burning. Mass extinction. We're seeing plants, animals, obviously insects are animals and forests are plants, but we've only had, of the 5 previous mass extinctions, only 1 of them did we lose the insects in the forests. And we're now accelerating in terms of carbon dioxide faster than them. Oceans, plankton, corals, fish, the acidification, ocean rise. I could do a whole program on this, because plankton is the basis that provides so much of our oxygen. The acidification, we're seeing the collapse of all of the ecosystems in the ocean, and sea level rise. The former head of the Jacques Cousteau Society, John Englander, said that if all human beings died overnight, the seas would continue to rise somewhere between 20 and 40 feet over the next 100 to 200 years. It's locked in. Soil, the amount of soil, the fertility of the soil, the moisture in the soil, all of it in collapse. And permafrost is becoming permanently thawed. We're losing massive amounts of methane that way. Arctic sea ice, Antarctica, Greenland, mountain glaciers. Most people have no idea how central this is. This is the most severe, or potentially the most severe. In fact, two major books in the last 10 years: The End of Ice by Dar Jamal, which is probably the most important book on climate change that I've ever read, or certainly one of them, and Peter Wadham's, one of the top scientists in the world, A Farewell to Ice. Because when the ice melts, all of that heat that was being reflected then gets absorbed, and then it's a further fast runaway. So we're seeing the great acceleration of Gaian collapse. And I get that this is difficult to take in, but we have to acknowledge this. Like that quote from Catton at the beginning: only by acknowledging and accepting the possibility of the worst do we have any chance to avoid the worst. So this is the great acceleration of Gaian collapse. Now you add to that abrupt climate change, which is like 10,000 years of climate change in just a few decades. And most of the scientists who study abrupt climate change say that somewhere between 1985 and 2000 is when things went hockey stick. That's when things just really took off in terms of abrupt, irreversible, runaway climate change. Meteorologist Nick Humphrey is one of my go-to guys on this. He has a 27-minute YouTube video called Ongoing Abrupt Climate Change and Consequences. That's actually a summary overview of his 16-part series, blog series, which I've recorded the whole thing. I'm mentioning a lot of resources in this program. I've audio recorded most of them, and they're available. I'll show you at the end where you can find them all for free up online. But I've recorded this, but this 27-minute video is a fabulous introduction to his 16-part series. And then just last month, I uploaded to YouTube, to the Post-Doom website, my post-doom conversation with Robert Hunsaker, an amazing and prophetic, I use that word, speaking on behalf of reality and doing so boldly, journalist who goes around the world. This is the world tour on abrupt climate change. We start in Antarctica and then go to Australia, Amazon rainforest, oceans, Greenland, and the Arctic. And we go region by region and what's the best science. Connie, my wife, spent 3 days adding all kinds of visuals and charts. This is a fabulous visual education. Really, it's an hour-long education on abrupt climate change. When most of the Arctic sea ice is gone, the serious global warming begins. And I'm not going to say more about this here, but learn about phase change and latent heat. In fact, this video, if you want something that's really sobering, this video, Maz Alone by Ken Avador, it's 23 minutes long. If you watch it on Vimeo, it's 23 minutes long. And it shows the absurdity of thinking that billionaires are going to be able to hide out in bunkers in New Zealand or whatever. It's a fabulous and difficult video to watch, but I highly recommend it. This is probably going to be the most emotionally challenging slide in this presentation. So you might want to pause this here now and take a deep breath or something. There are 440 nuclear reactors worldwide, requiring us to assume that industrial civilization has eternal life. Yet we are already 20 to 30 years into abrupt, runaway climate change. So here's the 64 million year question, not $64 million, 64 million year question. And I invite you to just take this seriously. Just ponder this question. As industrial civilization continues to collapse faster and faster, how many Chernobyl or Fukushima-like or worse meltdowns due to wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, tsunamis, power grid failures, political instability, or terrorism do you think are possible, likely, or inevitable? We're going to have some meltdowns, no question. But whether we have 5 meltdowns or 205 is going to make a huge difference in terms of what we do in this next 5 to 10 years. So again, I suggest that you pause here, take a breath, get up and walk or whatever, and then come back. We looked at the great acceleration, abrupt loss of biosphere, Gaian stability. Progress, overshoot, regress. The life cycle of civilizations. I consider this one of the more important questions, and most people have no idea even how to make sense of it. I first learned about this question from John Michael Greer, one of my favorite authors. What is the shape of the time in which you live? Well, for the first 95% roughly of human history, that is from about 400,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, it was stable within nature's normal cycles and rhythms. It was really ahistorical. There were minor daily and seasonal ups and downs. Of course, no human-made calendars or clocks, and no sense of progress. Even technological change happened very slow over vast, many generations. The last 10,000 years or last 8,000 years, however, we see about 3% of human history, things are rising, often for 1 to 3 centuries, a sense of expansion, of growth. This is city-based agricultural civilizations, carrying capacity surplus, a sense of more than enough resources. Now, of course, energy was primarily trees until the fossil fuel era. So this is known ecologically as an age of exuberance. Progress for the elites, at least, I mean, obviously not for the slaves in slave societies, but progress for the elites is not a belief. It's just an obvious fact. And then roughly 2% of the time, because it usually falls faster than it takes to get great, it's called the Seneca curve, declining. And this is where we see carrying capacity. That's an ecological concept I'll say more about in a minute. A deficit where there's not enough resources, not enough energy. A contraction. It's a post-exuberant age. The wealth gap widens. We see this over and over in virtually every previous collapsed civilization. And unworkability and denial reign supreme. By unworkability, I mean things that did work last week, last month, last year, last decade don't work now. And it keeps getting worse on that. And denial reigns supreme. Most people never wake up. Most people never get it. Most people go to their grave in one or another form of denial. I'll say more about denial here in a few minutes too. So my colleague Ugo Bardi wrote a book on this topic, The Seneca Effect, Understanding Systemic Collapse, Why Growth is Slow, but Collapse is Rapid. In fact, he quotes Seneca, the path of increase is slow, but the road to ruin is swift. And then Peter Turchin has written a number of books, Secular Cycles. He co-authored his book, Ultra Society, How 10,000 Years of War Made Humans the Greatest Cooperators on Earth. These are people who are taking the big picture. This is not just a few hundred or few thousand years. This is a 10,000 year view of these cycles, these patterns. Joseph Brodsky, famous Soviet literature professor, I think he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1987. I learned about this quote from George Lakoff, who posted it on his Facebook page. Lakoff is, of course, a very famous linguist. And this quote's pretty powerful. Brodsky said, "You Americans are so naive. You think evil is going to come into your houses wearing big black boots. It doesn't happen like that. Look at the language. It begins in the language." And again, what he's meaning by evil is that which causes us to betray the future. So in my Collapse 101 video, The Inevitable Fruit of Progress, I take a look at a number of concepts, a number of words that, depending upon how you interpret them, either lead us to do evil or lead us to do good. Wealth, success, progress, development, how these terms are defined makes a huge difference on whether we live pro-future or anti-future. Optimist, pessimist, these words matter, how they're interpreted. And of course, doomer, I'll say more about that later. But these words, depending upon how you translate or how you understand them, how you define them, basically, they will either lead you or lead us to live in a more or less pro-future way or a more or less anti-future way. And in my Sustainability 101 video, Indigenuity is Not Optional, I take a look at other words: God, religion, nature, environment. Turns out that the environment is not our surroundings, it's our source, sustenance, and end. But if we think that it's an it rather than a thou, we'll destroy ourselves. So here, I'm not going to go into any of that. I just want to look at one distinction, the distinction between primitive and civilized. Now, notice what you naturally think of. We've been conditioned to think of civilized as good and primitive as not. These quotes will call that into question. Forests precede civilizations and deserts follow them. All of our exalted technological progress, civilization for that matter, is comparable to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. The end of the human race will be that it will eventually die of civilization. The earth is littered with the ruins of empires and civilizations that once believed they were eternal. These are powerful quotes. Back in February of 2019, the BBC Future had a Deep Civilization series, and they had an article by Luke Kemp called Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse? And of course, he answered yes. And he had this incredible chart of 88 civilizations between 3000 BCE and 1000 of the Common Era. The reason he didn't go back before 3000 BCE is we don't have many written records further than that. And I don't know why he didn't look at the last 1,000 years, but just this 4,000 year period from 3000 BCE to 1000 of the Common Era, He has 88 ancient civilizations. The average lifespan was 336 years. And in my Collapse 101 program, I talk about all the different reasons. Here, I just want to point out that what we've learned is that collapse is a feature, not a bug. It's the nature of civilizations to collapse. Every single one of them, without question, has done so. Every human-centered civilization. There are such things as life-centered civilizations like the Kogi Indians in Colombia that tend to live ecologically, but most human-centered, city-based agricultural civilizations have collapsed. Or they all have. So here we see unsustainable means progress, regress. This is the Seneca curve. This is the last 5% of human history, last 8,000 years, 400 generations. And this is the pattern we see over and over and over again. Scores of examples. Usually it takes about 275 to 375 years. We see progress, overshoot of carrying capacity, and regress. We got progress, regress, rise and fall, boom and bust. And as I said before, collapse is a process, not an event. But the interesting thing is, what's the inner feeling? How do people feel during this time? What are their expectations? What's the emotional state? Turns out that when we're born and die in times of expansion, progress isn't a belief, it's a fact. It's, you've experienced it, at least human-centered progress. And of course, if you're born and die in times of contraction and collapse, well, that's just the way things are. You just expect things are going to get a little bit harder for your kids and your grandkids because you don't have the expectation. But what's most difficult is when you're born into times of expansion and in your lifetime it shifts and your expectations, that's called suffering. And that's where we are, of course. Ecological overshoot, fundamental category. We have to understand ecological overshoot of carrying capacity. Tom Wessel's The Myth of Progress, an amazing book. I've recorded the whole thing. Again, it's available. I'll show you at the end. But he's an incredible teacher. And he said, carrying capacity can be defined as the maximum population size that an ecosystem can support without being degraded in some fashion. When you see degradation, you know you're in overshoot. And then William Rees, probably the most well-known ecologist alive today, or one of them, our ecological footprint, co-founder of the ecological footprint concept. Human societies as temporally and spatially far-flung as the Mesopotamians, Mayans, and Easter Islanders came to ruin mostly because they expanded beyond the capacity of their environments to sustain them. This is my statement. If you don't get overshoot, you'll misinterpret or misdiagnose virtually everything important. And my wife, Connie Barlow, and I interviewed Bill Rees, and we just asked him to give us a tutorial. This is both of these, Tom Wessel's, same thing. These are fundamentally teaching videos where they teach about the essence of the ecological worldview. But also Carl North and Sid Smith. If you don't know, now I realize these are all old white guys. I get that. But they're also incredibly important teachers of the ecological worldview. Fabulous. I mean, I could have had Robin Wall Kimmerer do this as well. We just didn't get it scheduled yet. But also the granddaddy, Paul Ehrlich, the most well-known population ecologist and somebody who's grounded in an ecological worldview. I highly recommend all of these. Richard Heinberg's been an older brother on the path for many, many years. Our biggest problem is not climate change. It is overshoot, of which global warming is a symptom. So coming back to the book Overshoot, which many of us consider the most important book of the 20th century, the most important book we've ever read. Rarely does a book have its core message on the cover. So here we've got carrying capacity defined, maximum permanently supportable load. Cornucopian myth, euphoric belief in limitless resources. Drawdown, stealing resources from the future. Cargoism, delusion that technology will always save us from overshoot, growth beyond an area's carrying capacity, leading to crash, die off. And Stu Udall, who was the Interior Secretary under President Kennedy and President Johnson, in 1980, he wrote this incredible foreword that's one of the best devastating critiques of techno-utopian, what I call techno-idolatry, but it's don't ignore that foreword in Catton's book. One of the distinctions that William Catton makes that's really foundational is the distinction between problems, which can be potentially solved, and predicaments, which can't be solved. We have to adapt to them, live with them, Death, for example, is not a problem that can be solved. It's a predicament. So climate change, here's the things we focus on: ocean acidification, topsoil desecration and loss, sixth mass extinction, critical resource depletion, chemical and nuclear wastes, growing gulf between the rich and the poor, economic instability and insanity, political dysfunction, shrinking of in-groups, and the rise of totalitarianism and other isms. These are not the cause of our woes. These are symptoms of ecological overshoot. They are all symptoms of overshoot, which is itself caused largely by not having an I-thou personal, respectful relationship, a humble relationship with the biosphere, with primary reality, treating primary reality as primary. Cultures that do that can be sustained. Cultures that don't do that, self-destruct. So how we define and measure wealth, well-being, success, and progress makes all the difference. Whether we do so in human-centered terms, like defining wealth and well-being in terms of how well individuals are doing, or corporations or nation states, like GDP, gross domestic product, or gross national product, versus life-centered, ecocentric measures. That is, how well is the soil doing decade by decade? How well are the forests doing decade by decade? What are the other species? How well are they doing decade by decade? And so forth. That's the difference between anthropocentric or human-centered measures of wealth and well-being and life-centered. And that I consider the trim tab. So overshooting of planetary boundaries. It turns out, I got this image from Dr. Glenn Berry, that even if we could solve climate change, which we can't, it's a predicament, but even if we could, there are like 5 or 6 other planetary boundaries that are crushing industrial civilization. Not a matter of will it happen in the future, it's already been decades in the process. We just don't have the eyes to see it. So these are fundamental points that I want to make, that without an understanding of ecology, energy, and history, good people with the best of intentions will unknowingly propose and support policies likely to make a bad situation worse. As I said before, if you don't get overshoot, you'll misinterpret or misdiagnose virtually everything important. And in the past, the costs of denial were minimal. But given the nature of toxicity and trees, the consequences of denial now will last millions of years. Again, that's why I created this video. So I encourage you to take a break, pause, breathe, take a walk, come back. 10 certainties, pro-future versus anti-future hopes. There are many things that we are uncertain of. Many, many things. And people often focus on that. However, I think it's time to focus on the things that we're certain of, 99 to 100% certain. One of them is that there's going to be massive denial, grief, and blame. If you expect your friends and loved ones and neighbors and family to get this and accept this, you're out of touch with reality. Most people can't do that. They're going to be in denial. Denial is the largely unconscious habit of thought whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, our legacy, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of self-worth or superiority. Denial is also the instinctual impulse to reject or discount information that calls into question our hopes, assumptions, or expectations about the future. We all are prone to denial. It's evolutionarily deeply rooted in our particular species. So it was evolutionarily adaptive. So, you know, let's give denial a break. Let's not be beating up on people who are still in denial. We can have compassion for ourselves and others. Grief. Grief requires us to know the time we're in. The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the 4-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful or hopeless. They are 2 sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. And my most significant female mentor, Joanna Macy, the depth of your grief is the measure of your love. If you didn't love, you wouldn't be feeling grief. So we're going to see massive denial and grief. And need I say anything about blame? That's what happens. In contracting times, in-groups tighten up and everybody seeks to blame everybody else, not recognizing things like population pressure or ecological overshoot. Blue ocean event, BOE. One of the things we can be certain of is a blue ocean event. Now, it may be in the next few years, it may not be for a decade or longer, but it's inevitable. And that means a blue ocean event is when in September, when there's no sea ice or virtually no sea ice. So all that sun that was being reflected is now being absorbed into the shallow, because most of the Arctic Ocean is shallow, except for right in the middle. And there's a lot of methane, frozen methane. And so that water gets heated up, more methane, and it becomes a runaway feedback. We're already into that. Permafrost is already being released, and runaway methane is being released from the permafrost. And so that's now a certainty, which leads to chaotic, that is deadly jet stream. What has allowed civilization, what has allowed growing grain at scale is a stability of the Holocene. I go into this in my first video, Collapse 101, where I look at the big time perspective, but there's a very narrow range, and we've now lost that. So the jet stream's doing this loopy stuff and getting stuck in patterns where we're seeing intense droughts, intense wildfires, intense flooding, and so forth. Intensely unstable weather. The great conflagration of forests is inevitable. It's a certainty. Most of the world's forests are going to be burning in the coming decades. Just like happened in Australia last year, in California, Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, the Amazon, most of the world's forests are going to be burning over the course of the coming decades. This is now certain. Ocean acidification and ocean inundation. As I mentioned before, the head of the Jacques Cousteau Society said this oceans are going to continue to rise 20 to 40 feet in the next 100, 200 years, regardless of what we do. And the acidification is just all the coral reefs of the world are bleaching. This is now a certainty. This is why we have grief. Mass extinction of plants and animals, and we're quite possibly on this list. Population bottleneck is sort of a fancy, sciencey way of saying billions of people are going to die. Billions of human beings are going to die in the not too distant future. And that could very well mean you, me, my loved ones, your loved ones. Mass migrations. What's happening now in Syria and Venezuela and so many other places is just the beginning. Much of Mexico is expected to be almost like the Sahara Desert over the next 200 years. If humans survive for that long, where are those people going to go? They're going to go north, they're going to go south. No wall is going to stop them. And conflicts. And then nuclear meltdowns. As I said, whether we have 5 nuclear meltdowns or 205 or 405 could be the difference that we make in the next 5 to 10 years. But we're not going to do that unless we assume the worst. And did I say anything about massive denial? Don't you feel it? I feel it. I don't want to believe any of this stuff. I'm living 2 blocks from my granddaughter, my 7-month-old granddaughter. I don't expect her to live to be my age or even half my age. Climate denial, overshoot denial. It's not just on the right. I want to say something about this. Denial on the right is climate change isn't happening or humans aren't the cause of it. But the really pernicious climate denial and overshoot denial is on the left, the liberals and progressives, most of my friends. This book by Joyce and Michael Hausman, Technofix, Why Technology Won't Save Us or the Environment. It's such an important book. Here's 4 main points. That human technology that doesn't integrate with life's technology, nature's technology, always does more harm than good. It just does it over time. Technology in the context of ongoing economic growth does not promote sustainability, but hastens collapse. Most technological solutions to social and technology-created problems are actually counterproductive. Joseph Taylor wrote a very famous book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, on when we use technology and complexity to solve problems caused by technology and complexity, there reaches a point of diminishing returns where it just makes things worse. And this book shows why new technologies tend to be uncritically accepted, who really controls the direction of change, and why technological cultures predictably self-destruct. This movie, this documentary was blasted by the liberals and progressives, just blasted. Now, there's definitely problems, no question about it. But what all the critics didn't get is that the core message of this movie is that we are in ecological overshoot. That's a fact, not a belief. And no technology, no green technology, no green market, no green capitalism is going to save us. And so these resources, Megan Siebert's Planet of the Humans review, shining a light on the energy black box, Bill Reese's Crossroads for Planet of the Humans, Elizabeth Robson, Planet of the Humans, Why Technology Won't Save Us, and then Max Wilbert and Jennifer Mernan's interview with director Jeff Gibbs. I recommend these because these are devastating critiques of the critiquers. In other words, they're the ones that are pointing out why this movie was so important, even though it had serious flaws. And then this book coming out in a few months, Bright Green Lies by Derek Jensen, Lierre Keith, and Max Wilbert. It's vitally important that we not make an idol, that is, not put our faith or trust in false solutions, so-called solutions, such as having techno-optimism. Right? I like this, a Bizarro cartoon just from about a month ago. How about if your generation spends less time studying how my generation destroyed the environment and more time figuring out a magical solution? Techno-optimism quickly evolves to techno-utopianism, which I call techno-idolatry. Again, idolatry isn't bowing down to statues or believing in the wrong God. It's human-centeredness. And when you put your faith or your trust in technology, that's our savior, that's what I'm talking about. And that's what the IPCC is doing. That's what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have built into their models things like geoengineering, climate, so-called climate restoration, NETs, negative emissions technologies, and BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. These are insane. And all you got to do, you don't have to take my word on it, just Google carbon sucking unicorns. And you'll see what some of the top scientists in the world, like Kevin Anderson, are saying about these delusions. It's crazy to have these as part of the IPCC projections. They won't work. They can't work. So there are such things as things you can hope in that lead us in a positive direction, and there's things that you can hope in that lead us in a negative direction. So anti-future hopes are hoping for or expecting anything that would cause us to not prioritize sparing the future our deadliest toxicity, saving thousands of species of trees and plants, and learning and applying regenerative wisdom. Turns out that the difference between thousands of species of trees and plants going extinct this century and those same thousands of species of native trees surviving this century entirely depends on humans assisting them in migrating, because no other animal can move their seeds. Trees don't have legs. So anything that would lead us to not prioritize those, I suggest, are anti-future hopes. I love this quote from William Catton. Today, mankind is locked into stealing ravenously from the future. Human self-restraint, practiced both individually and especially collectively, is our indispensable hope. Now, he wrote this in 1980. If he'd written it sooner or closer to now, he would have said humankind, I'm sure. But the point is that human self-restraint, practiced both individually and especially, that is our indispensable hope. And what I mean by less, it's not just less with a lisp. I got this from John Michael Greer. Less energy, less stuff, less stimulation. And I've added one more S, which is many of us find deep meaning in helping to alleviate suffering, less suffering for others. So less energy, less stuff, less stimulation, and being committed to lessening suffering in the world. Degrowth, one of the most important movements on the planet right now. Decolonization, another massively important movement. Resilience, and then deep adaptation. In fact, deep adaptation, I want to say a little bit about Jem Bendell and deep adaptation, because they are doing such vitally important work. Jem Bendell wrote this paper. He's since written a revision that's just slightly adapted. But this originally came out in July of 2018. It went viral. More than 1 million people have downloaded this paper. Most papers are only read by a few dozen people. And Jem's deep adaptation Facebook group, here's my post-doom conversation with him. So I highly recommend the deep adaptation group. And I've actually recorded, I think, 20 of his posts, including the deep adaptation paper. So you can find that up on SoundCloud. Remember before when I said without an understanding of ecology, energy, and history, good people with the best of intentions will unknowingly propose and support policies likely to make a bad situation much worse? Well, here's a couple of examples. This came out a few months ago in Open Democracy. The faulty science doomism and flawed conclusions of deep adaptation. The claim that runaway climate change has made societal collapses inevitable is not only wrong, it undermines the cause of the climate movement. Not only is that wrong, what's wrong is that no, collapse isn't inevitable. It's already been happening for decades. We just don't know how to see it because we don't understand history. And then Michael Mann has a new book coming out just in a few weeks, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. Now, I'm sure there's going to be great stuff in there. I've not read it yet, but Michael Mann is one of the most respected climate scientists. And yet he attacks Jim Bendel and attacks others, people like me, I suspect, although I doubt I show up on his radar, as doomers, claiming that we're doing more harm than even the fossil fuel industry. Well, it's understandable that people do that. I mean, Connie likens things to an arm. If you're down here and you know that things are collapsing, and you've got friends that are up here that really genuinely believe if we just convert enough people, transform the right people, vote the right people in office, we can really still save things. If you're up here, you're going to resent people down here. So it's completely understandable that this kind of thing is happening. Drawdown, edited by Paul Hawken. Unfortunately, Paul didn't have to do with this title, but the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. This is crazy. I mean, there's some really good stuff in that book, but some of it, same thing here. Mark Jacobson at Stanford, 100% clean, renewable energy and storage for everything. And his solutions project. And then Bill Gates, again, just in a few weeks, coming out with a book called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. What is missing tragically and in all of these is they all presume economic growth. They all presume that industrialism, capitalism can continue into the future. It can just be greener. And this is going to have us do the opposite. We're not going to protect the nuclears from melting down if we believe this stuff. Again, as I said before, if you don't get Overshoot, you'll misinterpret or misdiagnose virtually everything important. So coming back to this where I showed at the beginning, we're at risk of civilizational collapse. It's not too late to win the climate war. We can solve the crisis and get to net zero emissions. The window of opportunity for bold action is closing. Green technology or green growth can reverse global warming. It's still possible to avoid societal collapse. Without a Green New Deal or whatever, we're doomed. No, it's not without something we're doomed exclamation point. It's we're doomed, period. Now what? This is a New York Times bestselling book. Roy Scranton is one of the authors that's being attacked by the people who still are up here, but like Jim Bendel. But I mean, Jim Bendel gets it. He says that collapse is inevitable. It's likely to be catastrophic, and extinction, you can't rule it out. It's possible. But also Roy Scranton's Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. These are also available in audio. And my post-doom conversations. I've had 75 post-doom conversations exploring overshoot, grief, grounding, and gratitude. They are so inspiring, these conversations. So again, I encourage you to pause, take a break, take a breath, get a drink, maybe get a stiff one. Unstoppable collapse. Here's where we've gone. We took a look at the great acceleration, abrupt loss of Gaian stability, progress, overshoot, regress, the life cycle of civilizations, 10 certainties, pro-future versus anti-future hopes. And I want to conclude with a very short section on It's Not Too Late, taking responsibility for our legacy. Now, the first thing to say is that it is too late for some things. It's too late to turn it around. It's too late to save Homo colossus, where each of us in the industrial world uses 20 to 50 times the resources and exudes 20 to 50 times the waste of Homo sapiens. It's too late to save Homo colossus. Homo colossus is destined for extinction. That may or may not include Homo sapiens. We just don't know. It's too late to win the blame game. Sure, you can continue to play the blame game, but it's kind of like masturbation. It feels good, but you're ultimately just screwing yourself. It's too late to reverse global warming. It's too late to transform the economy. It's too late to avoid reaping what we've sown. It's too late to slow or stop the sixth great mass extinction. It's too late to avoid a population bottleneck that is a die-off due to overshoot. It's too late to prevent a blue ocean event and massive methane release, the conflagration of forests, the loss of the coral reefs, and so forth. It's too late for a significant evolution of consciousness to transform the world. And it's too late to spare us from the consequences of millennia, not just hundreds of years, thousands of years of anthropocentrism, human-centeredness. However, it's not too late for virtually everything that gives life meaning and importance and value. It's not too late to pursue with as much passion as you can ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness. Anything and everything you do to promote, to further, to support ecological integrity, social coherence, and personal wholeness is a really good thing, and it's not too late for that. It's not too late to limit our deadliest toxicity, to cap and case the nuclear, to get all those spent fuel rods out of the swimming pools and into someplace like the Yucca Mountain. It's not too late for that. It's not too late to assist trees and plants and shrubs in migrating. As I said earlier, in the past, the costs of denial were minimal. But given the nature of toxicity in trees, the consequences of denial now will last millions of years. In my opinion, it would be truly tragic, evil on a geological timescale, to use religiously loaded language, if we allow thousands of species of plants and shrubs to go extinct just because we assumed progress was going to continue so we didn't have to do it. Or if we don't cap and case and protect and preserve and ensure as few nuclear meltdowns, and cap the wells, the millions of oil wells that are leaking methane. This is something we can do, but we have to be committed to it. And we're probably not going to do it if we're banking on perpetual progress. My wife is one of the leading point people in the world, really, on this field of assisted migration, assisting trees in migrating. In fact, there's a major new book that came out, W.W. Norton Press, written by Zach St. George, an award-winning journalist, called The Journeys of Trees, a story about forests, people, and the future. Just came out in June of 2020, and it features my wife, Connie, from the very first sentence throughout the book. It's not too late to do any of that. And it's not too late to be regenerative, not just doing regenerative things, but being who you be. Be regenerative in your community. There are always ways you can be nurturing and regenerative. Regeneration, these are permaculture, agroecology, indigenuity, that is applying an indigenous mind and heart to solving problems. Regeneration. See, regeneration is about partnering with nature. It's protecting the soil. It's promoting diversity. It's holistic rather than reductionistic. And these are some of the top people in the world. David Holmgren is, of course, the co-founder of permaculture. Denise Rushing, Joe Brewer, Daniel Christian Wall. I highly encourage you to watch these. Carefully watch these. There's some great stuff added to them in terms of visuals, but these are a grounding in the whole field of permaculture and regeneration. I love this quote from Paul Hawken. There is a rabbinical teaching that says if you're told the world is ending and the Messiah has arrived, first plant a tree, then see if the story is true. I suggest that building topsoil and planting trees while nurturing community, nurturing resilient community, is perhaps the most holy work that we can be engaged in. I mentioned before, less energy, less stuff, less stimulation, and being committed to lessening suffering in the world. And then resilience and promoting and learning from indigenous wisdom and experience. It's also not too late for what I consider to be the 5 L's of sane, sober, and inspired living. Love something, learn something, let go of something, laugh at something, and pass something forward. It's not too late to salvage something rather than nothing, as my dear friend and colleague Michael Milke likes to say. And it's certainly not too late to live life fully and love the life you live, even at Teotihuacan, that is the end of the world as we know it. What we know from previous collapsed civilizations, is that heroes, sheroes, saints, and sages are born. There's so much good work to do. So, a summary. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable, out-of-control mode for decades. This great acceleration of Gaian collapse is an easily verifiable fact. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Evidence is also compelling that the vast majority of people will deny this, especially those still benefiting from the existing order and those who fear that accepting reality means giving up. The history of scores of previous boom and bust, that is progress, regress societies, clearly reveals how and why industrial civilization is dying. Accepting that Homo colossus's condition is incurable and terminal may be key to not making a bad situation catastrophically worse. I suggest that to avoid becoming evil on a geological timescale, we must minimize our deadliest toxicity, nuclear, methane, our most toxic chemicals, and so forth. We must assist plants, especially trees, in migrating poleward, and invest time, energy, and resources in all things regenerative, including thriving with less energy, stuff, stimulation, and being committed to less suffering in the world, learning from and supporting indigenous wisdom and experience, and nurturing community eco-literacy, compassion, and resilience. Oswald Spengler was one of the historians, great historians of the 20th century, that compared side by side civilizations. And he says that when a civilization is in decline, optimism is cowardice. And along similar lines, optimism and self-pity are the positive and negative poles of modern cowardice. Our times call us to be courageous, not hopeful. And this is me just 2 blocks away from my granddaughter. This is why I do what I do. This is my now 10-year-old granddaughter in Texas. So I'm now going to talk about resources. If you've already seen this, feel free to just turn it off now. These are the resources that have informed this program and where you can find all the free stuff. Postdoom.com is my main website related to this. Here's our definition. I've tried this out with actually more than 100 people, getting feedback on doom and post-doom. Doom, definition, 3 definitions: a common feeling of ugh or dread upon realizing that technological progress and economic growth and development are the root of our predicament, not our way out. A name for the anxiety and fear called forth when living in a coronavirus era that triggers an economic depression. And doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration, with or without us. That's what Earth does. Earth will regenerate with or without us. Denial, most people think of doom as the midpoint or the end point. They think they're going to stay in despair the rest of their lives. No, denial is doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration. Post-doom is what opens up when we remember who we are, accept the inevitable, cherish our grief, and prioritize what is pro-future and soul-nourishing. By remember who we are, it kind of reminded of the Lion King, remember who you are, Simba. It's we are the universe. We're part of the universe. We're part of nature. We grow out of nature in the same way that apples grow out of an apple tree. We're part of the body of life. So what opens up when we remember who we are, accept the inevitable, cherish our grief, and prioritize what is pro-future and soul-nourishing? Post-doom is a fierce and fearless reverence for life and relative equanimity, even in the midst of abrupt climate change, a global pandemic, and collapse of both the health of the biosphere and business as usual. And post-doom is living meaningfully, compassionately, and courageously, no matter what. I'm not going to say more. I'm just going to show these pictures, but I highly recommend, as a spiritual practice, take one of these every few days. Watch several of these a week, these incredible post-doom conversations it's like a who's who of major people who get the big picture, including the scariest of the scary stuff, who've done the heart work, and then who can help us come through to inspired local action and to this place of post-doom. So again, I really encourage you to go to postdoom.com and check these out. These are absolutely inspiring. This is how I came to this 5 stages of awakening. One of the older brothers on this path, who I had a post-doom conversation with, Paul Chafurka, has this climbing the ladder of awareness. Most people go through this process from dead asleep, full denial, awareness of one fundamental problem, awareness of many problems, awareness of the interconnections between the many problems, and awareness that our predicament encompasses all aspects of life. Oh, that's the other thing. Paul Chafurka also says that William Catton's book, Overshoot, is the most important book he's ever read in his life. But I mapped this on exactly from 2000 to 2012, to December of 2012, to be specifically. I was in total denial. I had an ecological understanding from the 1980s to about 2000, but then I read several books that put me on a techno-optimist, human-centered, linear understanding of evolution and a linear understanding of history. And so I was in denial. And then on December 3rd of 2012, Connie and I watched David Roberts' TEDx talk called Climate Change is Simple. The remix adds some music, and it just rocked my world. So then immediately I started crying, and Connie and I bought a whole bunch of books related to climate change and abrupt climate change. So in 2013, I became aware of many problems. 2014, aware of the interconnections between the many problems. And then in January of 2015 is when I read William Catton's Overshoot, and I became aware that our predicament encompasses all aspects of life. And I've spent, as I said, the last 8 years, I've spent between 20 and 50 hours a week studying, and I've recorded dozens of books. These 3 videos that I mentioned before are all about, it's like my trying to take the essence of what I learned over the last 8 years and put it in a digestible form in 3 videos. So consider this video that you just watched to be an introduction to these 3. But the one I especially recommend is Post Gloom, because that'll help you emotionally relate to this stuff. These are some of the books I've read and recorded. I've recorded the audio. I'm not going to say a whole lot about them right now, but these are the cream of the crop, literally the top of the top books related to collapse, ecological overshoot, the rise and fall of civilizations, and so forth. So I highly recommend just going to SoundCloud. They're all available for free. And then I also, if you're a pastor or a rabbi or somebody that does groups, I do 15 to 20 minute Zoom homilies or sermons. And then I usually send out the link to my Post Gloom one and then schedule a 60 to 90 minute Zoom Q&A. So feel free to reach out to me if you want me to do that. And then 22 essential top rated books, 80 foundational articles, like over 400 hours of the best books and essays. Are all available for free up on postdoom.com/resources, as well as the Collapse Wiki, the best movies and documentaries, not just my opinion, but what others in this movement. Nate Hagen's a dear colleague. He's got these fabulous Reality 101 videos. He really gets energy too, and does a lot with it. And then various educational programs and presentations. So all that's available there. It's all available for free. If you want the convenience of a flash drive, you can go to the postdoom.com/flash drives. But again, all of those things are available for free up online. And here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you for watching.